My name is Dennis Speed, and I'd like to welcome everybody here for our Schiller Institute two-day celebration of the life and legacy of the poet and statesman Friedrich Schiller. The Schiller Institute was founded in 1984 and has published several translations and articles on Friedrich Schiller. It's a unique institution which, in specific in this world of today, has made a contribution, in particular as a result of the work of its founder and leader, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We're going to be hearing from Helga in just a moment. I just want to say a few words to put into context where the Schiller Institute's contribution has been made. We see particularly certain things going on in China, the Belt and Road Initiative, and that now globalized process of development, which was specifically and uniquely initiated by the leader of this movement and organization and her husband, the statesman Lyndon LaRouche. One of the problems that exists, it's important to talk about, is how important is the cultural and aesthetic development of the individual to the changing and the development of world history. A couple days ago, when Helga made a webcast reflecting on what had not happened in the World War I commemoration that occurred in Paris, she pointed out that there were 60 world leaders together, and you had the opportunity to really reflect on why the First World War happened. Why was the world really sleepwalking into a great tragedy that really ruined the entire 20th century? Because it led to World War II. That was the problem that she posed. She said it would have been a perfect opportunity to think about that, to speak about that, and to make real pledges that this should never, ever again happen to humanity, and that opportunity was lost. When Friedrich Schiller gave his opening lecture in 1789, called What to What End and What Is and to What End Do We Study Universal History, the first sentence of that lecture said, "Gentlemen, it is a delightful and honorable commission for me to wander into the future at your side, through a field which reveals so many objects of study to the thinking observer, such magnificent examples for the emulation of the active worldly man, such important explanations for the philosopher, and such rich sources of most noble joy for everyone without exception, the grand and broad field of universal history." In the work of Lyndon LaRouche in particular, he extended the Schiller Institute's observations on the question of universal history to include what the scientist Vladimir Vernadsky called the noosphere and its subsidiaries, the biosphere and geosphere. That is, that universal history is indeed the history of the universe and its development, and that man and what mankind does and the contributions made by mankind are a geological force in the universe. They are not merely subjective opinions that may or may not converge upon real natural processes, but indeed human cognition is the very impulse tendency of creation and development in the universe itself. Coming back for a moment to the unfortunate Macron, Helga pointed out that he said that Europe should become more independent from the dollar. The euro basically should be strengthened and be less dependent, but he also called for a European army outside of NATO. And then his finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, a day or so afterwards said that Europe should be an empire, naturally a peaceful empire, but an empire to match the other empires like the United States and Russia and China. So, in fact, on the 100th anniversary of the conclusion of World War I, this character proposed exactly what caused World War I to happen. He proposed precisely the human flaw, the arrogance of empire, the hubris of imperial domination, which had destroyed the world and caused Europe to cannibalize itself. There were over 20 million deaths in World War I, over 9 million military and approximately 10 million civilian. There were another 20 million wounded. But then, in 1918 and 1919, 50 million other people died as a result of the Great Flu epidemic. No one exactly knows whether or not the encephalitis epidemic of 1916 through 26 was related to this process. It's not exactly clear. But what is clear is that that war was the precursor to something called World War II, in which over 100 million more people were killed. So these processes are processes that were induced by human beings and can be stopped by human beings. For example, what was the actual impact on human history of Franklin Roosevelt making, in his inaugural address, the assertion, "First, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." What did it mean to the human race that that was said that day, March 4th, 1933, and what he then acted to do? The aesthetic education of individuals, the philosophical development of the individual mind, is the very impulse for creativity under certain circumstances for the universe itself. What happened back in 1989, in November, in a collaboration between Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche, was a process was kicked into being, called then the Eurasian Land Bridge. But it was a philosophical outlook that led to a series of conversations and discussions and interventions that were led by the person you're about to hear from. And they resulted in what is now referred to as the Belt and Road Initiative, or the New Silk Road, or in our last formulation of this, the World Land Bridge. Because of the earlier focus of our organization, starting from about 1978 on Friedrich Schiller by this individual, that collaboration has created echoes in the power of the reason of people all over the world, which have now put the human race in position to leave behind its childhood, to leave behind war, but only if we can find world leadership, meaning in individuals, that decides to act upon that world historical identity. That opportunity was lost in Paris on November 11th, but it is an opportunity that we are here to help create and help succeed at the end of this month in the case of the discussions that will happen in Buenos Aires, which President Donald Trump will be involved with, President Xi Jinping, and also Vladimir Putin in. But our organization, in order for it to do what it needs to do, should be focused at its highest, in its highest cognitive capability by the work and inspired by the work of the poet Friedrich Schiller. And there's nobody on the planet that is more capable of getting that across, if it can be gotten across, to humanity, to an audience, and to you, than Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and it's always my honor to introduce her, so I introduce to you Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, let me say in the beginning, can you take the echo out? That, there is absolutely the potential that in a much quicker time than most people have an inkling of, that we could experience very consciously the beginning of a new epoch of mankind, where we put the danger of war behind us, where we cooperate among nations in a completely new set of international relations based on a win-win cooperation, and where we devote all our resources, both our creativity as well as physical resources, to solving problems, solving poverty, solving the questions of science, challenging us to make the next step of breakthroughs in the knowledge about the universe. I can see all of that to happen fairly soon. Now, the relationship between President Trump, President Xi Jinping, and President Putin are absolutely key to achieving at such a solution, as improbable as it may seem to most of the people. Now, we could see in actually a year or less, or a few years, a change from this present dark age, which we experience, especially in the West, which could be as fundamental as and groundbreaking as the golden Italian Renaissance of the 15th century was when it replaced the horror shows of the dark age of the 14th century. And I like to remind people that it was possible to overcome a dark age, to establish something which was the foundation for the next 600 years of European history. And I think that this is absolutely possible today. As a matter of fact, I don't think I'm overly optimistic or caught in a utopian idea when I'm absolutely certain that the very goal of the Schiller Institute, which we set out to accomplish when we founded the Schiller Institute in 1984, namely to establish a just new world economic order on this planet, and with the idea that this would only be possible if it was combined with a classical renaissance of classical culture, where each nation, each civilization, each culture would bring forward its best traditions, and that they would cooperate to a new and higher renaissance for the entire human species. That was the goal of the Schiller Institute, and I think that is possibly about to happen. Now, after I have stated with absolute certainty the possibility that that may happen, I also want to state equally clear that there is the danger that we again are sleepwalking into a world war, exactly as it happened before and into World War I. Now, the reason why this is absolutely the case has a lot to do with the fact that the reasons why World War I happened and the present situation, why they have many differences and new factors, there are also some fundamental parallels. Namely, that it was the geopolitical theories of the British Empire before World War I, as they were expressed, for example, by Halford Mackinder, who developed this idea that whoever would control the Eurasian heartland would eventually control the whole world, have dominance over the world, and this would be at the disadvantage of the sea powers, especially the British Empire. Now, I don't want to go into the very complex history of before World War I. And if you start to study that, it is actually an extremely interesting situation where each nation has, especially the 6 participating major empires and nations, they have produced long documentaries how it came to World War I, and naturally they all have a specific angle. And it really would require a super long life to study all of these, and because it's many biographies and notes and documents and so forth. But the parallel to today is nevertheless very visible, that if you apply this geopolitical thinking, it was then the emergence of the Trans-Siberian Railway, the role of the role of Russia, the possible expansion of the importance of the Eurasia, the continent, as compared to the sea power. And today, it is very clearly that you have the the policy of the Belt and Road Initiative promoted by China, which is already, has inspired and drawn into cooperation more than 100 countries. And naturally, it is the reappearance of Russia under the leadership of Putin as a global power, which is, basically emerging to be a very important strategic factor in the situation. Now, it also is what is often described as the danger of a Thucydides trap, namely that the up to then dominating power, in that case, the United States, is being or about to be bypassed by the second power rising, namely China. Now, why did we come to this point? When the Soviet Union disintegrated, the neocons in the United States, with their collaborators in Great Britain, decided that now, since communism was defeated, that basically it was time to establish an unipolar world whereby, based on the US-British special relationship, they would basically run the world according to their principles and likings. You remember that at that time, the historian Fukuyama declared that this was the end of history, that from now on, democracy would rule at all corners of the world, and simply, that there would be no more competing systems, but it would all be based on the Western model. Now, for Russia, the so-called shock therapy was supposed to take care of that. The idea, that you would transform the former superpower Soviet Union into a third world raw material exporting country, and under Yeltsin, in collaboration with the West, looting Russia, this was very well underway, and the industrial potential of Russia from 91 to 94 was reduced down to 30%. So essentially, this was a decade of genocide in Russia, of demographic collapse, but the importance of Russia as a global power was clearly eliminated. Then the idea, by allowing China eventually a little bit later to join the WTO, this was also combined with the idea that China as a communist power would be eliminated, and that with the opening to the WTO, China eventually would not only fully adopt free trade, but also Western values, democracy, human rights, and basically stop to be anything different than the West. Now, for the rest of the countries which were not yet on that line, there was regime change, color revolution, the axis of evil, which was supposed to get rid of all the countries, not fitting this Western model, or would not submit to this Western values idea. Now, with it naturally came the idea that you would eliminate all kinds of mercantilist tendencies in the economy, or state-controlled systems, and that basically neoliberal ideas would take over. There was the push for deregulation of the financial markets. And as a result, naturally, the gap between the rich and the poor widened. Now, this eventually went on for some while, but led then to a global rebellion against this neoliberal geopolitical policies. We have seen, as a result of this rebellion, the Brexit. We have seen the election of Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. We saw the election of a new Italian government rejecting all of these values. and also many other European governments basically following in the same line. Now, China, however, did not behave according to this script, but China discovered its own roots, and it went back to the policy of the new Silk Road, of the ancient Silk Road, by putting on the agenda the new Silk Road. Now, that was only one element, namely the tradition of China, but I think the Belt and Road Initiative was also, in cooperation with other countries of the BRICS and other Asian countries in particular, a reaction to the 97 Asia crisis, which my husband at the time had warned was not an Asian crisis, but it was the beginning of a global financial crisis, which would simply come in different phases, but be all part of the same process. Now, in that Asia crisis, it was very clear the speculations of George Soros speculating the currencies of Asia down in 1 week by 80%, that this eventually strengthened the idea that the so-called developing countries had to form a resistance and that they had to go in a different policy. Now, what China, especially Xi Jinping, then addressed was not only the terrible lack of development and especially investment in infrastructure left by 500 years of colonialism, but also the regime which was imposed by the negative aspects of the Bretton Woods system, which was influenced by Truman and Churchill and not fulfilling the aspirations of Franklin D. Roosevelt to end colonialism with the Bretton Woods system. But they introduced this terrible injustice towards the developing sector. And therefore, when the World Bank and the IMF were in charge of giving credit and defining the conditionalities for credit for developing countries, these conditionalities basically meant a debt trap. They meant the conditionalities forbade the development of infrastructure, of investment in social systems, in education, and in this way prevented the developing countries from ever making the jump to become industrial countries. And if the IMF did not succeed, the rest of it was done by the evil ideology of the Club of Rome, insisting that we are living in a planet of limited resources, that you have to have only sustainable growth, basically population reduction, and no development. And then also the World Wildlife Fund augmented this idea by putting the idea that snails and spins and spiders are more important than human beings, and therefore dams and water management and all of these things should not be produced. So there was a tremendous vacuum, so that when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, in a very short time, in only 5 years, this development exploded. And in over 100 countries, the new Silk Road spirit absolutely caught on by giving the developing countries for the first time hope to overcome poverty, to become industrialized countries, and actually not only repeat what the industrialized countries had done in terms of development, but by leapfrogging to the most advanced areas in science and technology with the help of especially China, but also Russia, but also in a secondary way, India, Japan, and other countries. So this happened after 2013, and for about 4 years, the Western powers, the Western media, think tanks, almost ignored the fact that this new system of the Belt and Road Initiative emerged and grew extremely rapidly. Now, this was incredible already by itself, because here you have the largest infrastructure program ever undertaken in history. Already now it is becoming about 20 times as big as the Marshall Plan, and it's open-ended. And the Western media decided to basically ignore it. There was no objective coverage. There was no documentaries, no featuring of it in the Western media. But then about, I would say, approximately 1 year ago, there was a sudden explosion of attacks on China in the think tanks, basically accusing China of pursuing a new colonialism, luring countries of the developing sector into a debt trap, being an authoritarian system, and obviously for the countries participating with the Belt and Road Initiative, this was completely ridiculed. Many leaders of the third world from Latin America, Asia, and Africa absolutely rejected it and said that now, because of the cooperation with China, they have for the first time the chance to develop, and they want to be treated as equal partners and no longer listen to the sermons of Westerners who are talking about democracy and human rights, but bring in no development. So this false propaganda against China did never fly in the developing countries. It did confuse and harass naturally the population in the United States and in many or some European countries. Because if people don't know what is going on really, then if you only have the Western media narrative, indeed it is very difficult to find out. Essentially, the same thing happened concerning Russia. There was a complete demonization of Russia by inventing a completely fake narrative. The narrative started with the supposed annexation of Crimea through Russia. And all of a sudden, it was completely eliminated from the memory or the conscience of people that the West contributed in the plundering of Russia in the 90s, that the reason why you have oligarchs in Russia still to the present day was because they were supported by certain Western powers. And this narrative, this fake narrative, also pretended that never was a promise made to Gorbachev, to Russia, at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and even before, at the time of the unification of Germany, that NATO would never expand to the borders of Russia. This was just totally forgotten. And naturally, the Ukraine crisis was not triggered by Russia annexing so-called the Crimea, but it was triggered by, as Helmut Schmidt once said, by the Maastricht Treaty of the EU, which decided to turn the EU into an empire, according to Robert Cooper at the time, namely to add countries moving forward to the east. Indeed, NATO and the EU ever expanding until the Russian borders and possibly as much to the east as possible. That was completely eliminated, and it was then forgotten, or the EU association agreement was basically nixed from the memory, as well as the Nazi coup in Kiev, and the result of it, the referendum in Crimea, which was the free decision of the people of Crimea. And history all of a sudden seemed to start only afterwards. And as Putin said at several times, if it would not have been the Ukraine, they would have invented some other story. Now, in January, the National Defense Strategy paper was published by the Pentagon. And there was just recently, a couple of days ago, a report published by the National Defense Review Commission of the Congress under the leadership of Eric Edelman, and basically in the spirit of McCain. And what does it say? And I read you a quote so that you get the flavor of it. They say in the executive summary, the security and well-being of the United States are at greater risk than at any time in decades. America's military superiority, the hard power backbone of its global influence and national security, has eroded to a dangerous degree. Rivals and adversaries are challenging the United States on so many fronts and in many domains. America's ability to defend its allies, its partners, and its own vital interest is increasingly in doubt. If the nation does not act promptly to remedy these circumstances, the consequences will be grave and lasting. And then a little later, today, changes at home and abroad are diminishing the US military advantages and threatening vital US interest. US authoritarian competitors, especially China and Russia, are seeking regional hegemony and the means to project power globally. And then later on, these trends are undermining deterrence of the US adversary and the confidence of American allies, thus increasing the likelihood of military conflict. The US military could suffer unacceptably high casualties and a loss of major capital assets in the next conflict. It might struggle to win or perhaps lose a war against Russia and China. The United States is particularly at risk of being overwhelmed should its military forced to fight on two or more fronts simultaneously. Now, obviously, this is a total view of the neocons. It's the idea that the world will be divided into blocks forever, and that the idea of a multilateral, multipolar world is completely unacceptable. Now, the neocons are clearly not giving up. Nevertheless, they are in complete contradiction to what President Trump is continuously saying, namely that he wants to improve the relation with Russia and China, and that to have good relations with these two countries is a good thing and not a bad thing. Now, at the same time, when you have this neocon mobilization in the United States, and Dennis already mentioned that, President Macron of France is calling for a European army outside of NATO, and basically, misusing really the commemoration of the First World War, which, as Dennis mentioned, this was really the opportunity to reflect about the future of civilization and think how we can make sure that war will never happen. Basically, Macron attacked basically Trump. He used the stage of an international, focus to put himself as the counter of the nationalist and populist, and basically calling for more independence from the dollar without actually saying how this desolate euro should accomplish that, and basically calling for a European army against Russia, against the threat from Russia, China, and the United States. Now, at the same time, or one day later, the French finance minister Le Maire called the need for Europe to become an empire like the United States, like China, and basically, really, it is unbelievable that in these times people would have the nerve to attack the nation state from the standpoint of empire, as if that would be a superior form of government. Now, in my view, Mr. Macron and his entire government is suffering from an excess of grandeur, given the desolate condition of the European Union. Macron's popularity right now is dropping like a stone. Just today, you had all over France huge demonstrations where people were blocking the roads, bringing the traffic to a complete standstill in a protest against austerity, against high fuel and gasoline prices, and against Macron's very austerity policy. So this is a complete mass strike ferment in France, which can have all kinds of interesting implications in the near future. At the same time, the EU is really disintegrating. You have the EU Commission and the EU in a complete clash with the Italian government, which refuses to continue the orders of the EU to implement austerity at the detriment of its own population by saying they do not want to repeat the mistakes made in Greece and Spain, and they just want to have an investment policy and growth instead. Now, Germany, the grand coalition, so-called, of Mrs. Merkel is not so grand anymore at all. It's a small coalition of only 40%. It could not even have a majority if it would now be a vote. And, Merkel could be out very soon, because you can have a government reshufflement when Seehofer is probably going out beginning of the year, and Merkel could be out. However, the German situation is in a real crisis, because the possible, or one of the possible replacements of Merkel, CDU politician with the name of Merz, who is a complete neocon. He's a neoliberal. He wants to have a coalition with the Greens. Now, there's even talk about a Green chancellor. And both of these options would mean the end of Germany as an industrialized nation. Because what the Greens are calling for is the complete decarbonization of the economy, which obviously, is based on the idea that CO2 emissions cause climate change and global warming, which is a complete fraud. And if you look at the fact that of all the human activity, only 0.2% have had an effect on the change of the climate in the last 100 years, and that since the last so-called Little Ice Age in the middle of the 19th century, the increase of temperature was only 0.8%. And at that time, you had very cold temperatures, with the Baltic Sea completely frozen, with the Bodensee completely frozen. So, it was actually not a tremendous increase in temperature at all. Now, Germany, which foolishly went out of nuclear energy without having really a replacement, if Germany under this CDU Green leadership would go into the decarbonization, meaning no coal, no fossil fuels, only so-called alternative energies, this would be worse than the Morgenthau plan. It would mean the complete collapse of the German economy. And given the role of the German economy for Europe, it would mean the collapse of all of Europe, apart from the fact that it is a form of eco-fascism, because as everybody admits, even Schellenhuber, the former head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Consequences, admits that if you decarbonize the world economy, the population by the planet is exactly 1 billion. So what should happen to the other 6 billion is naturally the big question. So I just wanted to, in very broad strokes, paint this strategic situation to argue the fact that in front of this strategic setting, the proposal made by my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, that the only way how the world can get out of this present crisis in danger of a new sliding into war is by having a four-power agreement between the United States, Russia, China, and India, and that not being exclusive, but an open coalition for more people and more countries to join. So the immediate step which must be taken by these four governments is to have a new Bretton Woods, new credit system. We are right now not only in a crisis of Europe, which has a European banking crisis, which is completely in a centrifugal dissolution process, but we are sitting on the verge of a new financial crash. We have right now the possibility of a repeat of 2008, only on a much larger scale. There is right now 40% more increase of all the parameters which led to the 2008 crisis, but especially the corporate debt is the ticking time bomb right now, which could really explode the system at any moment. And actually, the amount of speculative money which is floating around the world on a daily basis has also increased by several times, by being at this point $5 trillion every day of speculative monies, partially in nanoseconds, being speculated around the globe. Now, all the tools of the central banks have been used up. You cannot do endless quantitative easing. And it is basically right now sitting on a volcano. So the immediate setting for this would be that the four countries cooperate for a new Bretton Woods system. And naturally, that would be the task of the G20. But given the fact that in the G20, there are several countries which are absolutely stuck to the old geopolitical neoliberal paradigm, it can only come out of a discussion process between President Putin and Trump, President Trump and Xi Jinping, and that they discuss basically a new Bretton Woods system, which would incorporate a global Glass-Steagall approach. It would incorporate national banks for each country. It would mean an international credit system to finance long-term international investments in projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, and basically go for a cooperation with the new Silk Road on a win-to-win basis. Now, this would obviously require that there must be a conscious decision to avoid the Thucydides trap, to basically not regard the other countries as competitors and adversaries, but to work together on a win-win basis. Now, for the United States, this would mean that rather than increasing the military budget, which is already $700 billion and about 10 times as big as that of Russia, that basically you would instead work together to reconstruct the American economy. Now, it should be obvious to everybody that latest when the catastrophic fire in California is causing unprecedented damage, and simultaneously much of the East Coast and other states have been caught with winter storms without any preparation, that the lack of infrastructure investment, lack of water management over decades in the United States is absolutely to be addressed if this whole question of the competition of the systems is not supposed to become mute by simply the economic collapse of the United States. Now, at the beginning of 2018, China already had 22,000 kilometers of fast train system. By the end of this year, they will have completed the largest part of rail connection of fast trains between Beijing and Hong Kong, which will be 2,230 kilometers. And in a few years, I think 2 years, China wants to have all major cities connected through a fast train system. On the other side, the United States has not 1 kilometer of train line faster than 250 kilometers, while the Chinese fast train are 350 kilometers. And basically that is only on a very short distance of 200 kilometers anyway. So if the United States would cooperate with China to invest in a fast train system in the United States, rebuild the real economy, and then overcome the trade deficit by joint ventures in Latin America, Asia, and especially the development of Africa, we could basically have a completely different world in the near future. What we are campaigning for with the Schiller Institute internationally, but especially by appealing to the four leaders of Russia, China, and India, and the United States, is to develop a completely new set of international relations. That in order to do that, we must look at the world from the standpoint of the future. How do we want the world to look like in 100 years from now? Basically, if we avoid the present dangers, we will have commercially usable fusion energy. We will have, as a result of fusion and the torch uh, technology, limitless energy supply. In the first phase of heavy deuterium and tritium, which is practically unlimited available in the ocean water, and in the second generation through helium-3 as a fuel in the fusion process. We will have villages on the moon. We will have industrialization of the moon for joint missions to Mars and soon other heavenly bodies. And we will have the kind of cooperation as it just happened, I think, yesterday or today, when the very successful launching of the Roscosmos launching of the Soyuz FG carrier rocket with the Progress MS-10 cargo spaceship bringing supplies to the ISS, International Space Station. And at the same time, the Cygnus NG-10 spacecraft was launched from the Antares with the on board of the Antares rocket from the Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia in the United States to the ISS. So this kind of cooperation in space is actually the model for the future relationship among nations. Now, I'm also convinced that with what is going on, for example, in China, where Xi Jinping put a tremendous emphasis on the aesthetical education of men because of the goal to have beautiful minds and souls of the pupils and the students, reviving the tradition of Confucius and the 5,000 years of history in China. And many other countries looking back to their own best traditions, like in Russia, like in Africa, like in other places around the world, that if we in the West would also go to the ideas of Friedrich Schiller and the idea that you need an aesthetical education for the ennoblement of your own population, that soon we could indeed discover what a beauty this universal history has produced already up to this point. And in the United States, for example, I think, like in Germany, we are in dire need to counter the present collapse of our culture, the explosion of drug epidemics, the violence in the schools, the mass shootings, the suicide because of despair, but especially the increase of violence and perversion in all expressions in our youth culture, that we urgently need to look to the ideas of Confucius, of Schiller, and other great minds of other countries to have the kind of ennoblement of our population. And we don't need to be worried about the systemic competition with other cultures like that of China or Russia, because if we in the West do not get our act together and go back to our own high traditions and cultures, we will soon collapse anyway. But since I'm an optimist, I think that the potential is absolutely there. And President Trump, who has miraculously defied the onslaught of the British Empire, a coup attempt against him, who has been able to win seats in the Senate in the midterm election, which was not the case with the 5 previous presidents in the United States. I think we have the absolute possibility to go into the kind of mobilization to move into a new paradigm. But for that, I need your support. You need to work with us in the United States, and we have to have the kind of absolute mobilization to reach this new paradigm, because mankind is at a crossroad like never before. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. So we're going to go right to the questions and answers. We have a somewhat unique group of, unusual, I put it that way, grouping here today. So we should actually make sure that we take advantage of the opportunity, especially because of what we're going to be going into tomorrow, to ask the questions that are both on people's mind, but also try to think about posing those questions in a way that can actually get us all in shape for what we have to do tomorrow and for the rest of the month. So first question is right here. Go ahead.
Hi, Helga. I was going to ask you a question that I've been asked about what the U.S. has to offer to the new Bretton Woods, but really I think at the end of your talk you really captured my imagination about culture and what it ought to be like. So I wanted to ask you if you could paint for us an image of what culture should be like. Maybe it's easier to imagine what it's like to have high-speed rail and how that will change our lives. How should we envision the kind of cultural relations to expect among people in the kind of world that we're hoping to bring about?
Well, I mean, there is a tradition in China of emphasizing aesthetical education, which was, at least concerning some thinkers, very much inspired by Friedrich Schiller. And I was just reading an article by one former dean of the Beijing University who wrote about aesthetical education. And he said that he came to the conclusion that the source of all evil is greed, desire, that people who are driven by desire, um, have they want material things, they want objects, and that becomes more obsessive. And the more obsessive they become, the more they are willing to step over rules, to even become criminal and really become totally evil. And then he said the only thing which remedies that is beauty. Now, I think that this is absolutely true, because once people start to discover the beauty in music, the beauty in classical music, in poetry, in painting, and just discover the lawfulness of what it means to write a classical composition, either in music, in the drama, or in poetry, well, it captures their mind, and they are so overwhelmed by the beauty, which appeals to the senses, but it's also, according to Friedrich Schiller, something which is a notion of reason. Schiller says we do not need the sensuous experience of beauty to come to the conclusion that it's beautiful, but beauty is a notion which reason defines. And if then something in the sensuous world coincides with that, it is a pleasure, but you don't need the sensuous experience first. You know what beauty has to be. And since beauty is both appealing to the senses and to reason, while you are exposed to it, it is having this aesthetical effect of improvement. It ennobles your emotions. You become, the more you engage in it, a better person, and you develop the inner strength to reject the ugliness of the present culture. Now, I can only, my image of how the culture will be is like, between the great scientific minds of the past, the relationship between Schiller and Humboldt, Schiller and Goethe, at least for 10 years when they indeed did work on the aesthetical lawfulness of poetry, or between Einstein and Planck, where, if you look at the letter exchanges of these great minds, they are fighting for ideas. They are discussing the merit of universal principles. And, a scientist or a musician for that matter, or a poet, once they are really into their great art, this has become so important to them that they would never chase money on the stock market, or they would never, try to have as many Porsches as possible. And, in a certain sense, you become transformed and you become a completely different person. So I think that the future of mankind, when we reach that, which I think is eminently possible, will be among cultures that kind of relationship, like musicians from the world which are already working in the same orchestra, or people working in the same chorus, that the relationship will be simply based on, I have a terrible noise here, I don't know if you can hear that, that basically the relationship will be among people relating to the most creative aspect of the other mind, and that we will stop being naughty little children kicking each other, and that we respect the creativity of the other person, and that this will be then when human beings become truly human. And I think that we are tasting that already.
Here.
Hi, Helga. So I have what's maybe a bit of a half-formed question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's about dynamics in history, and which I think is also, could be said otherwise, the process of the evolution of the human species. And I think that you have discussed this quite a bit. So has Lynn. So have people like Percy Shelley and Rosa Luxemburg. That in human history, you have these historical moments, and in those moments, you have, acting at the same time, you have an unconscious process which is sweeping people along in a certain direction. But you also, at the same time, require the intervention of a very conscious type of leadership who has an insight, a foreshadowing of the future, of where mankind needs to go. So I guess my sort of half-formed question here is, I wonder if you can talk about, so that we can think about it for the organizing and think about the physical force of ideas and what kind of process and moment we're living in right now. I was wondering if you could just discuss this a little bit, what's acting on people in perhaps an unconscious way, but then at the same time, the necessity for a very conscious intervention, which is of the creative type, I think, which is of the same type of the creative discovery, which rejects and goes against everything that existed before.
Well, I think what we are seeing right now in many parts of the world in different ways is a global mass strike process, so to speak, a global rejection of the old paradigm. I mentioned already the election results in the United States and in several European countries, and this is basically you would never have thought that this would happen. The Brexit, we may have a fall of the May government on Monday or a couple of days later. You may have a complete change in France very quickly. So, this is already a tremendous process of rejection of this old paradigm. You have a completely different type of process in Africa, for example, where on the one side, naturally, you still have terrible problems. Many people are trying to flee to Europe, risking drowning and in the Mediterranean. And I mean, you still have these extreme problems of poverty and terrorism. But at the same time, you have a completely different spirit where many leaders of Africa are reinforced and assured by China, defining the goal that their country will be a fully industrialized country in a very short period of time, with a wealthy middle class, with basically a country where they will be on the top level of science. Now, who would have thought that the so-called developing countries all of a sudden say we do not want to be second class nations, but we want to be in an international division of labor where we will take certain leading scientific areas and cooperate. So then you have basically the potential that the whole world order could be changed. I mean, people never thought the Soviet Union would collapse. Lyndon LaRouche, my husband, in 1984, when his proposal for the SDI was rejected by the Soviet government at that time, he said, if the Soviet Union continues like that, they will vanish in 5 years. And nobody, I remember this very well, nobody believed that this would happen. And many people in Russia also admit that even in Russia, I mean, nobody thought the Soviet Union would ever disintegrate. Now we are talking about something completely different. Now we are talking about that the present world system, which was basically leading because of geopolitics to 2 world wars, and we're still not out of the danger zone of having a 3rd world war if these crazy ideas like what I reported about the National Defense Strategy Commission report, if these ideas and the European Army idea, if these ideas prevail, we could have a 3rd world war. But what people cannot imagine, but I think it's eminently something for people to imagine and really understand that this is already happening, that you could have a new world order, a new system where geopolitics does not exist anymore, where you do not have the kind of competition where you have a zero-sum game where one wins and the other loses, but that you can actually establish a completely new set of relations among countries based on sovereignty, on respect for the other social system, that you do not proselytize your idea of your values, but that you actually engage in a productive dialogue where you refer to the best tradition of the other country and vice versa. And that basically you define the relationship from the standpoint of the common aims of mankind. That this is a possibility, most people really have no idea and have never thought about, that this is something to be desired. But I think that, if mankind is supposed to survive, and I think this is a very serious challenge, either we make that jump or we blow ourselves up. That is not an academic question, and that is not something for the far distance. You have some military in the United States who say a war with China is very likely to occur within the next 15 years. And there was even a Rand Corporation study which said it's better to have the war now, because now the casualties would be less than in 10 years from now. So there is this craziness absolutely existing. So therefore, and there is also this idea to have an increase of tactical nuclear weapons, to have a limited nuclear war. Well, I think that the arguments made by people like Ted Postol and others, that once you start to use nuclear weapons, it will go all the way. It is the very nature of nuclear war that once you start it, all weapon systems will be used. So I think we have to really look at this possibility of the annihilation of mankind, to then take out of this possibility the absolute energy to say, no, we want to have a new paradigm, a new phase in humanity. And I can only say the reference to the 14th century and the Golden Renaissance was a total rejection of all the axioms which existed at the time of the 14th century, a century which was characterized by scholasticism, by witchcraft belief, by superstition, by the thinking of the peripatetics. And all of that was rejected then in the Golden Renaissance because of a renaissance of Plato, which was brought to Italy at that time by the Greek Orthodox delegation, initiated by Nicolaus of Cusa. Nicolaus of Cusa himself said he will write now a method of thinking which has never been thought by any man before. And he developed the idea of the coincidence of opposites, that you can think the one of a higher quality than the many. And I think this is a concept which absolutely can be applied to the present situation, that we can think of the one mankind being of a higher order than the many, and that meaning many nations and many cultures, and that we can actually start to think in terms of solutions. Now, if you make a new discovery in any field of science, or if you compose a classical composition in music, or if you write a poem according to classical criteria, your mind has to accomplish exactly the same thing. Because if you want to develop a poetical idea, a musical idea, and then apply the principles of thorough composition by exhausting all the potentials which are lying in that idea, your mind has to do exactly that. You have to form a concept on a higher level than, simply prose. If you want to just write prose, you will never arrive at a poem. In the same way, if you want to make a classical composition, you have to have that unity of the entire musical idea, at least in germ form, before you set the first note. Or, you have to have the first musical idea having involved all the potentials. So the thinking of this oneness, the thinking of the future, is exactly something you can train your mind to think. And, as I said, classical music, classical poetry are the best training to train your mind and not stick to the axioms of contradictions, not to stick to the Aristotelian idea that A is either A or B, but that you can actually synthesize the higher quality, which means thinking the new conceptions. And I think that that is absolutely something which has been applied to history many times before. I think it was essentially the quality of thinking leading to the Peace of Westphalia. And it is exactly the kind of thinking we need now to overcome this terrible danger of a new confrontation between the United States, China, Russia, and possibly even the silly Europeans, at least the silly ideas of European army, which I think is really an outgrowth of this, idea of geopolitical confrontation. So I think, given the fact that we are celebrating Schiller's birthday, I can only advise people to read The Aesthetical Education of Man by Schiller. This is developing exactly that idea that the future of thinking must belong to the artists, to the scientists, because these are the only people who basically, think in terms of provable principles and not of opinion. And on that level, there is no limit to the generation of new ideas. And that is exactly the kind of thinking we need right now.
Just so people articles by Helga, The Deep Moral Crisis of the West, Why We Need a Renaissance of Classical Culture, and It's Now or Never for the New Silk Road. So that is in the back, and that is available. Schiller books you can order from our organization, and we can get them to you. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Helga. Dave Meiswinkle here. I
I
appreciate
have
your... Yes?
a terrible noise here, and I cannot hear you well.
Okay. I appreciate your presentation. One of the things that struck me when you're talking about basically the possibilities of a thermonuclear war, the insanity that man might even himself. You mentioned one of the projects could be to use the moon as a stepping off spot for exploration of the universe. Now, I've had the fortune to be in Chaco Canyon. That's in New Mexico. It's one of the 4 darkest spots in the world. And from that area, it appears that you're right in the Milky Way. And they have telescopes there where you can see easily the rings of Saturn, and you can see the Andromeda galaxy. And I think that when you see that, you are humbled, you're awed, you're in mystery. You're totally in connection with the divine. To think that we are a little planet in the Milky Way with hundreds of millions of stars as big as our sun, if not bigger, is a certain reverence there. Now, it's always confused me that supposedly we were on the moon, and nobody that I know, maybe you can correct me, no country, whether China or Russia or Germany, has put people back on the moon. So I would think that that's a good idea. And when you can see the stars like I've been able to see them, it creates a different energy, a different appreciation of life, a different value system. But in our big cities, at night, you never see the sky. You never get beyond sort of more or less the fog of our reality here. So I guess my question is, and I think it's a good point, how do we get to the moon and set up installations there with other countries and start exploring the universe and start appreciating our position in the universe? Thank you.
Well, I think this is indeed a very, very good point, because I think that anybody who has looked at the Hubble pictures sent back from their exploration, I mean, this is an unbelievable. I watched a movie a while ago where you see all the different formations of the stars, the planets, which are multiple. I mean, they discovered now that there are, to our present knowledge, 2 trillion galaxies. Now, you say the Milky Way is already breathtaking, and for sure it is. But the very idea that our galaxy is only one of 2 trillion, I mean, that really puts awe into you, and it really demonstrates the point that our knowledge as human beings is really just the very first baby steps about how our universe works. And I think the good news is that especially Russia, China, and India, apart from the United States, they have actually very ambitious space programs. I think the Chinese space program, while it started relatively late, has really leapfrogged, and they have, I think, this Chang'e 4 and Chang'e 5 missions. I think even later this year, going to the far side of the moon. Then India also has a very ambitious unmanned space program. But all of these countries definitely have the perspective of Mars missions. And, I think that the very successful cooperation between Roscosmos and, and NASA is showing the way. And I think to make the step between between the United States and China to abolish the legislation which forbids the cooperation would be absolutely key. And if these 4 nations, the United States, Russia, China, and India, would put all their space research efforts together, and naturally they already have invited many other countries to participate in it. ESA also has a quite significant idea of a new village on the moon. So if you would put together and pool all of these efforts, I think we could really have the kind of absolute revolution in the productivity on the planet, because as it was the case with the Apollo project, all the breakthroughs made in space had multiple benefits for the economy on the Earth. Already now, space medicine, space-related agriculture. I mean, you would revolutionize everything in terms of a completely new economic platform. And that is exactly what we have been proposing to the presidents of these four countries. Actually, you know, we have written I have written a letter to them, and you know, we also have made a campaign that they must make this step, looking at the world from the future, to overcome this present situation. And I think, you know, I think that, you know, naturally the first reaction in Russia is this is completely impossible, even if President Trump would agree at a summit, let's say, with Xi Jinping to such an approach, or with Putin. He would come back home, and the neocons and the neoliberals and the War Party and the Democratic Party, they would immediately nix all of that. Naturally, that is a danger. But on the other side, you know, if these four presidents would basically take an approach which would not be an effort to overcome only the bilateral tensions among their countries. In other words, not just look at how to remedy the conflict between the United States and Russia, or the conflict between the United States and China, but to say, you know, that they work together with the idea to uplift the entire human population out of its present dangers. There is the danger of thermonuclear war. There is the danger of a new financial crash, and that these leaders put together a proposition which addresses the dangers for all of humanity, like a new Bretton Woods system would do. That would outflank the opposition, because it would cause so much excitement. Just imagine if the four presidents, or even two presidents, and then maybe later another two, if they would come out with such declarations and say, we will work together to eliminate the danger of war. We will create a new financial architecture, a new Bretton Woods system, which will launch the biggest development industrial program in the history, and we work together. This would shake the world. This would absolutely be feasible, and it would electrify the populations, so that the war party in each country, you have each country has war parties, people who are orthodox, you know, military, or, you know, basically people who would not agree. It would outflank them. It would absolutely cause excitement, and you could call it the, you know, the new Silk Road spirit, or the new paradigm spirit, or whatever you would call it, or even the Buenos Aires spirit would catch on, and it would transform the world. The problem is, our task is to cause an environment where we can, you know, in that case, give support to President Trump, because if he has backing from the American population for such an idea, the chance that it can happen is there. While if, you know, if it's not in the population, then it's much more difficult. But, you know, I think that we are on the verge of exactly accomplishing that. And I agree with you, lifting the eyes to the stars, and the, you know, the largeness and the beauty of the universe is exactly what frees us from this idea that we are in a limited, you know, in a closed system of a planet with limited resources. That is an oligarchical idea, and looking at the universe at large shows you, you know, we are not in a closed system, but we are just a tiny blue planet in a huge universe, which we are just beginning to explore. And if we want to survive as a human species, then that is exactly what we have to do.
Jane, and then Diane's going to say something about tomorrow We're going to continue questions, but I just wanted people to know. Also, I was given this: the new Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge. We have, I think, 5 of these in the back, so someone was asking about it. So here's the report, and you can purchase it in the back. So go ahead, Jane.
I thoroughly enjoyed your very comprehensive and explicit statement, position. And what comes to my mind is that I come to these wonderful programs. I hear your exposition of brilliant LaRouchian ideas and FDR ideas and Plato ideas and so on. And it's very thrilling, but I think we need to have a debate. And it seems to me that I am sitting among the converted. To preach to the converted is not enough for us. And I believe that I read about your husband's having had a couple of famous debates at some point, which created a great stir. It seems like we've got to stir things up. We know what we see. We know our history. We know all of many of the arguments. And so I'm trying to imagine who might you debate. And someone that would really that could stand up to you, woman, and you have strong arguments. But I have to say a small little a parenthetical thing. A young man I know who's dying to become wealthy in the stock market asked me to go to a free meeting this morning before I came down here. So I said, well, I could give him a little time, but I had another commitment. So I went to the meeting, and the free meeting was to discuss how young people or old people could invest in the stock market as individuals. And it struck me as here the position of the speaker was you can invest through an organization, or you could become a good little stockbroker on your own. And he mentioned institutional investment. And of course, he mentioned Goldman Sachs and hedge funds. And I thought, my Lord, I mean, it's like a world apart from the LaRouche world. So I just say that as something is amiss. People are not able to synthesize ideas. We have Maimonides, Moses, the Golden Rule, what else? Who else? Confucius. We have all these people on our side. We have great leaders. You are a great leader. Trump is a great leader. Putin is a great leader. Xi Jinping is a great leader. Modo seems to be doing very nicely. Duerte. So what's going on that we're not having some kind of stimulating challenge to what we know a lot of answers? And then I'll say finally, as one last thought, is it's interesting the man spoke about Sonoma and seeing the Milky Way. That would be an extraordinary experience. So maybe we ought to send some pilgrims to China to see the maglev. How many of us here have seen a maglev in person? Maybe we need pilgrims like the pioneers went out west and saw, etc. Thank you so much for bearing with my struggle to challenge you a little bit, because you need a challenge, not you, but we need to see the challenge before us. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm open to debate anybody, so bring it on. I would actually encourage you to pick out somebody, and let's work on it. I mean, the policy basically has been to prevent exactly that, because after my husband successfully won the debate with, I think it was Abba Lerner. No, it was, I forgot now. Was it Abba Lerner? Maybe. In any case, he won a famous debate in Colombia, I think it was in 71. And then our opponents basically decided that they would never allow that to happen again, simply because, we would out discuss any of these opponents. But I'm perfectly willing to do it, and I think, you are absolutely right that we need more debate. And tomorrow there will be a concert, so hopefully there will be a lot of people being touched by the beauty of the classical music. And as you know, we plan to build more conferences in the coming year, which can you find out from the people there. And the idea is not to stop this mobilization with the G20 and whatever happens with these summits, but that we want to really go in the next several months at the beginning of the year into a absolutely unprecedented outreach in all pores of the society in the United States and Europe and also other countries, to exactly put this idea of a new paradigm on the table. Because, in a certain sense, there is a complete vacuum right now. You will have Trump probably being in a freer position now that the Mueller investigation is really reaching certain rocks, but it will remain a big fight. But I would really say that with the campaign we did with Keisha, with Ron Wisurek, what we did in several of the states of the Midwest, there is an absolutely openness to discuss the ideas of my husband, of LaRouche economics. So I think that, we should just, I like your idea. I would like to have a debate nowadays. You can have actually an international debate, between countries which would be in a conference call from Russia, from China. We could have a debate about that, where we would amplify our outreach, beyond what we are doing right now. I absolutely agree with you that we have to put our minds together. Pilgrimages to China, I have advertised already 20 years ago. I made a speech in Washington, I think in 2000 or so, where I said why Americans should go there. And I made a quite good, I must say, presentations using a lot of documentaries of the ancient Silk Road, the Taklaman Desert, and try to encourage people to go to China. Because when I was in China in 2014, where I had the pleasure to be invited to visit parts of the ancient Silk Road from Lanzhou to Dunhuang and further west into the Gobi Desert, I actually saw how the railway was built from Lanzhou to Urumqi, which they built in half a year. And I saw how it was built simultaneously at like 20, 50 places. And a few months later, it was ready, while I only saw little tiny excavations, which later became the gauges. So I can only encourage people, go to China. And naturally, it's not such a big deal. I drove with the Maglev in the test run in Emsland. This is now unfortunately no longer functioning. But I also drove from Pudong to Shanghai, from the airport to the city. It's not such a big deal. Much better is the Chinese fast train systems, which I like much better. They are faster. At this point, the Maglev may be another generation faster, but they are so quiet. I mean, anybody who traveled with a Chinese fast train will be convinced that that's the way to go. So if you have any possibility, go to China and spread the word, because everybody who either was in China, worked in China, is married to a Chinese, they all have a completely different view, and they would never fall for all the lies being spread about China, because what China is doing is really the greatest strategic initiative on the planet right now, because it does offer a way to overcome the geopolitical danger. And if people, just would know that, it would help a lot. But maybe we should work on such an idea of building an international video conference and trying to involve as many networks, social media, and so forth, and debate this idea, like the Federalist Papers. Can mankind govern itself, or are we condemned to continuously destroy each other? And maybe we should build such an international video conference. I think that that would be a first step in the direction you are saying.
Hi. Um, can you see and hear me? Barely? Oh, I'm asking Helga also. You can hear me? Yeah. Well, just in terms of what we are doing tomorrow, one, everybody who is not already in the chorus should be at the concert, because hopefully what we'll come across between the music, the opening of Bach, the African American spirituals, and the Beethoven, and then interspersed will be quotes from some of Friedrich Schiller's works, will be a very palpable idea of Schiller and what he represented. And I've just been thinking about a couple of things as you were speaking. One, this question of joy, or this question of happiness, and how that is so connected with scientific progress and economic development. Because when you get a sense that you have a future which is better than the present, there's a certain quality of optimism in which all kinds of crazy things that you get very obsessed with and that are very grinding and wearing just totally evaporate. And I think, and then I was reflecting on what occurred in the 1960s in the United States, where we had Kennedy's commitment to land on the moon. So you had spectacular breakthroughs in science. You had the highest standard of living that we've had in the United States in many years. But coupled with that was the vicious onslaught of the Congress of Cultural Freedom. So that instead of the natural explosion of development and goodness of people, you had instead a population that was prepared to accept an unnatural entropy, where you reach a condition as Helga mentioned earlier, which is the forest fires killing we don't even know how many people, or a situation in New York City where literally it can take 6 hours to get from New Jersey to New York in a snowstorm, or sometimes not in a snowstorm. If you're on a subway that breaks down, or the Portal Bridge, the little man who has to come out and hammer it back together after a boat goes through doesn't work. I mean, these things, it's actually unbelievable what we've tolerated. And I think this quality of education of emotions, what I talked about at our Schiller celebration, where to do the good, even if it's against your quote-unquote physical well-being, becomes your first impulse and first instinct, is not something that's remote. I think it's very possible, and I think that it's a quality of a cultural renaissance combined with the kind of economic breakthroughs that we have to get. The last thing that I'll say, I was very struck at our rehearsal last night, because the chorus that we have assembled here in New York is just an extraordinary bunch of very, very different individual people. And the thing that unifies them is their commitment to the music. And I realized last night from a couple of conversations with members of the chorus how completely impassioned they are, how personally they take their relationship to this great art. And that is, I guess, another way, a Kuzanian way of creating a kind of unity among people who find themselves diverse. So I just would really encourage people not only to be there tomorrow at 6:30, but to get everybody that you know to be there, because they will be very sorry after the fact if they miss it.
Okay. So you've raised California a couple of times, Thursday on the webcast and then again today, so I feel a little compelled to address this question. I mean, I don't know if people even really know how insane California has become, so I want to situate that a little bit and then get at the fires, and then ask a question which in some ways comes up and based on discussions with the team there in California. Because California is probably the most partisan state. I mean, you can't reference Democrats without people looking at you like you're Satan, or Democrats in a positive way. In any reference, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, and they still look at you like you're trying to put a smiling face on the devil. So, so it gives a sense of the kind of the hyper-partisan environment that this last couple of years have represented. But let me just give people a quick sense who don't know. California, there's now an outbreak of typhus in Los Angeles. People don't know typhus is spread largely by like human feces not being disposed of properly. So you've got, it's not Skid Row, it's like skid blocks all over Los Angeles. There's a homeless epidemic, which then it leads to a typhoid epidemic. You've got now San Francisco's approach is to create what they call, everyone's heard of the Geek Squad. Best Buy has this tech company has Geek Squads. They now have poop squads in San Francisco. They're paying people like $90,000 a year to deal with human waste on the streets. And it's more than they pay like the social workers to deal with the homeless. They've got people that are paid to deal with needles. So there's a kind of breakdown there that's hard to imagine when the state was the leading industrial and scientific state 50 years ago. Today, half the state's children are in poverty. It's got the second worst educational system in the country. So it's just been mangled and destroyed. Now, the fires actually give an expression of this, I think. People might not know this. It's called the campfire, so everyone thinks it's started from a campfire. But what they're saying is that the fire started, this massive fire, it's so big, and the smoke is so bad that for the last week, we've had red alert smoke in the Bay Area. This is 300 miles away. The smoke has just barreled into the Bay Area. It's been now practically 10 days straight. We can't even have field squads out. Actually, we were out in Livermore 2 days ago, and a press van stopped and wanted to interview us because they said, we want to know who is so dedicated for their cause that they would actually be out in this smoke. It's so bad. Now, what they're saying, the cause of the fire is now in Paradise and then also in Malibu, but then last year in Sonoma were caused by electrical lines and PG&E problems. Now, it's not clear what the problem of the infrastructure is, but it's very clear that these fires are a result of a process of 20 years of major neglect, because you had the deregulation of the energy program with Enron, and you had the bankruptcy of the state, and then you had practically what was a colored revolution with Schwarzenegger. And Schwarzenegger came in, he was backed by Rothschild. He was backed by Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett took him to Jacob Rothschild. This was a hardcore British program. And Schwarzenegger brought in a hardcore greenie and a hardcore austerity program. Now, people might not remember this. We covered this in 2007 in our video on the coming financial crisis. We actually compared it to the Weimar inflation. Hyperinflation. We pointed to Schwarzenegger and Bloomberg as the key figures of a fascist policy in the United States. And Schwarzenegger was that, and a hardcore. One of the main things Schwarzenegger did was cut all of the fire infrastructure. So anything that was redundant, anything that you wouldn't use except under severe emergency circumstances every decade, those were cut out of the budget. They never came back. Right? He was governor until 2010. The crisis hits in 2008. And this massive fire infrastructure was cut. There's now talk of actually renting planes from Russia, because the Russian planes would be the best ones. But their infrastructure was cut. The firefighting capability was cut on a state level. So the forests are actually federally managed. That's where Trump's a little off. But in general, he's absolutely right. And Jerry Brown did nothing to deal with this. Now, at the same time, we had 5 years of drought. And we kept saying the whole time. I ran a campaign for Congress. Keisha ran a Senate campaign in Texas on this drought question. You're going to have massive forest fires. You're going to have major destruction to the state. 130 million trees died during that drought all over California, just left to burn. Not green, dead wood out in the places of California. Not cleaned out, not dealt with, just left there. Then we got a small, brief period of rain a couple of years ago. And people will remember this because the infrastructure is so bad. One of the largest dams in the country about nearly broke, called the Oroville Dam, because of this small window of rain that we got. Brush growth took place all over the place, and it's a perfect storm for fires the last 2 years. But it's also the electrical deregulation and the electrical lines. So it's been 20 years of economic insanity that we warned. It's been a fascist policy directly from the British through Schwarzenegger, which has led to this. And so I think we've been on this entire time, on Enron, on Schwarzenegger. We ran the campaign. It endeared us to a level of the Democratic Party in California because we went after Schwarzenegger as a Nazi backed by the Rothschilds. And this is exactly the kind of policy you get. An epidemic in homelessness, the typhoids, the fires. This is the policy we've been referencing. So we've obviously got to save California. We've got to save the country. One of the things you've said, though, in the last couple of this last week was very striking because you made it very clear. And it was striking because the partisan environment of the last 2 years in the United States has been extreme. Because of the coup, it was the Democratic Party being pulled by the nose by the media. You had this very partisan environment. And people in California took the election then very personally, and many people saw it as a loss. The Democrats took the House. This is a total loss. And I think that's a national phenomena to a degree. But your response, and I think rightfully so, was that we're closer to a breakthrough than ever before. And what was clear is that we have to look at the world from a global perspective because the Belt and Road is stronger than it's ever been. The discussions internationally are stronger than they've ever been on the Belt and Road. And so maybe my question is for you to elaborate on how you see this perspective of a new paradigm that we're so close to. We're very close to chaos and world war, but we're equally close to this breakthrough. And I think right now we have to overwhelm the American people with this sense of the potential. You know, what you said early in 2017, that Trump could be the greatest American president in American history. It really rings true today. He said again, he's got the votes to make sure Pelosi is Speaker of the House. I mean, he's really provoking the entire political class of the country. And we know if he adopts Lynn's and our policies, that's a very, very possible idea. So I'd like you to address that more if you could.
Well, I think that the key will be to discuss this idea about Western values, because I mean, when I think one of the last webcasts I mentioned, I think I mentioned, I forgot now what the exact occasion was. I mentioned the fact that you have these mass shootings in the United States. You have already more than 300 this year. This is, the rate continues. It will be an increase over last year, which was 345 mass shootings in 1 year. And only the most spectacular ones still get the kind of coverage. I mean, anybody who looks at that, I mean, if you take all of these things, the collapse of the infrastructure in the New York greater region, what you just reported about the lack of forest management, I mean, this is not just in California. If you go in Virginia, you see the same thing. I mean, there is no forest management. I mean, Germany has many problems, but there is still forests are being managed. They are not. Dead wood is being cleaned out. New colonies of trees are being planted. there is actually a conscious approach. So, it's more like a garden. It's not just some, leave it as it is. Anyway, who looks at all of these aspects of the American present society, the lack of infrastructure investment, the length of commuting time, the violence in the schools, the opium epidemic. I mean, anybody who puts all of this together and does not recognize that this is a collapsing society is just not, it's just not in their right mind. And I think a lot of people sense that. So then I said, well, look at what China is doing. They put a ban on hip hop music because the lyrics are actually degrading. They have a degrading image of women and a degrading image of men. Anyway, so, and also they are banning banal quiz shows because it destroys creativity. So anyway, I got then a very upset answer by somebody who had listened to me. Said, "Are you proposing to get rid of the First Amendment?" No, I'm not saying that, but I think that there must be an absolute recognition that what is being peddled as Western values is really not it's not the freedom of expression of your own opinion. But if you have an onslaught where everything goes in terms of culture and the common good is basically kicked with the feet and completely neglected, then you must have a rebellion against that, and you must have an uprising where people demand the common good. And in a certain sense, that is the kind of broad discussion which we have to have. And I think that is exactly what we have to generate, because I mean, I can only say that it's in the air. Like, for example, when the GDR collapsed in '89, it was probably clear to the party leaders in the spring of '89 or the summer of '89, the latest, that the country was completely bankrupt, and they tried to hide it. And then, you had this sudden trigger with the visas, where people did not like the fact that they could not travel outside the Comic-Con countries. And within weeks, you had the Monday demonstration, going from a few hundred to a few thousand, then to 100,000. And finally, there were millions, I think 2 million in the street. And that is the kind of process which we need. We need the kind of, public expression that people do not want this collapse anymore. And that, I mean, they basically, have to create the environment. Trump had this meeting with the executives of the entertainment industry after one of these shootings. I don't know what happened to that, but I think we have to fuse all of these different things together. The people who are upset about losing their properties in California, the people who are involved in the commuting time. I mean, we have to somehow get all of these elements together. And that is actually what we will try to accomplish in our organizing efforts in the first 3 months of the coming year. So I think that that will be a unique opportunity to fuse these different evils, or rather the rejection of these different evils, lays them all into one effort. And I think that that will be key to get the United States in a different mode. And I'm absolutely convinced it will be done, because, things come to a breaking point. I don't think this can continue much longer. And, I already said to the German Industry Association argument that, there is now a systemic fight between the Western model and the Chinese model of, basically state control. And I don't think the West has to worry about who will win. If the West cannot take care of its next generation, of its children and youth, that there will be an organic disappearance of the Western system. And there must be people who can see that and who we can mobilize. So I think we are closer to a breaking point than you can imagine by looking just at the facts as they are. The European Union is in a centrifugal disconnect. I cannot say how quickly that will go, but the speed is accelerating. The financial crash is coming. The cultural collapse is coming. It's like, it's never the same. It's not like '89 in the GDR, but it's the kind of process where the tension becomes so big that a break is coming. And it will be our intervention, our giving leadership to this by fusing these different elements into one. And I think it can be done.
We're going to take this as the final question. Go ahead, Alvin, and then ask Helga to do a summary. Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Helga. This is about the choral effect as we're on the eve of the concert. Earlier in our rehearsals, Diane and John urged us, all members, to read Schiller's Song of the Bell and On the Sublime, with the idea, of course, that if we did not have that understanding of what we were actually presenting, then we would fail in our objective to communicate these ideas. And Diane just talked about how, in her view, which is all important, that effect was taking place and occurring with members, with all of us within that. And last night, humorously, John, in our presentation and our singing early on for Beethoven's Choral Fantasy, stopped us and pointed out how we were, the way we were singing it would come across much more like the Nazis' version of it. And he told a story about that, some of the history, and needless to say, we made that correction quite quickly, and that was heard and felt. Now, for that choral effect, Thursday night, I live 12 miles from Midtown Manhattan, and it took me 6.5 hours to get home. I won't go through the details, but I'll tell you that I took a bus, a taxi, a long walk, a train, another long walk, a train, and then a long, long wait for a cab before I finally got home. That took 6.5 hours. I probably slept maybe about 4 hours. And the choral effect was this. It was a long, tough day. One of the things that helped would be telling those around me, coworkers, this story. One asked me, "Did you lose it?" And I said, "No, because I sing." And exhausted as I was, I think everyone's experienced this before, that final rehearsal changed everything for me while I was still tired. These things are still amazing to me, how that happens. And it was a joy, even though I was tired. So the other thing, of course, was during that Thursday night, the glimpse of chaos was very clear. The type of people were losing it, and I was in all these different places where this would be expressed through this kind of gauntlet of traveling I was doing. And so you really see the need for us to present these ideas to a desperate population so that they don't lose it, which is what the guy said. "How did you not lose it?" I said, "Well, that wouldn't have helped." So I wanted to share that with you and let you respond.
Well, I think when you perform the choral fantasy, this is one of my absolute most favorite pieces, exactly because it has this idea of the beautiful soul you're addressing. Nehmt denn hin, ihr schönen Seelen, diese Gabenholder Kunst. That's exactly the emotion of love, of, speaking to the divine spark in the other soul, and transmitting this idea of the beauty of great art. So when you do this tomorrow, you should be joyful and happy, because that is exactly the kind of spirit of the new Renaissance. I think, the ode to joy, the choral fantasy, these are the best expressions to know with your soul and with your mind of what this new age has to be, what this new paradigm of civilization can really mean for all of humanity.
Thank you.
Raise and see if you want to take this up as a part of your conclusion, which is that in 1989, and you already began to talk about the German situation, but you were poised to see something in a way that very few people have ever been poised to see it, which was the sudden recreation of a nation, in the case of Germany, even as your husband was in jail, in a situation where at the time, of course, most of us thought he could very well die there because of the way in which George Bush, 41 in particular, and others had sought his demise. But at the same time, the day after the first breach in the Berlin Wall, Lynn, from jail, promoted or advanced the idea of what was the Eurasian land bridge. It was a seed crystal of what we're talking about right now. Schiller has this idea that man is greater than his destiny. And so I wanted to know if you would say something further about, your own subjective, not merely experience, but the way in which you were able to deploy using this idea, which was completely new. Yes, Lynn had referenced these things, and he's doing this from jail. And at the same time that we have the problem of that situation of Lynn, we had this capability, and then we had to do something. You did at that time, because I think what's important for us to think about is, what are we that we are able to get world leaders of nations? We don't have a nation. We don't have power in that sense. Where does our power come from, and how was your own situation in that circumstance? How did you think of what you had to do and then proceed?
Well, I mean, this was a process which, the the whole, if you remember, the period of the SDI, we had many discussions with people from the Soviet Union, this, more than 1 year back channel discussions, then the rejection coming from Moscow, the announcement of Reagan of the SDI, Lynn's draft proposal for the relation of the superpower 1 year later, his prediction that the Soviet Union would collapse in 5 years. Then we went to the Kempinski Hotel in Berlin in '88, where Lynn said the German unification comes soon and Berlin will be the capital, and the unified Germany should develop Poland as a model for the transformation of the Comecon. So then, when Lynn was put in jail, then all of this development happened. So in my mind, there was never a doubt. We had followed the economic difficulties of the Comecon. So in a certain sense, we were the only people, the absolutely only people who were not surprised when the wall came down. And I'm saying that with, full, determination, because, the Honecker, if you remember, he said at the 40th anniversary of the GDR, big military parade, he said his famous it sounds like rhymes, den Sozialismus in seinem Lauf hält weder Ochs noch Esel auf. that the socialist GDR would be there in 1,000 years from now. I mean, socialism in its proceeding is not stopped by either the donkey or the oxen. I mean, that's what the line says. And then 3 weeks later, I think even 2 weeks later, he was out. And 3 weeks later, the wall came down. So it's clear that Honecker was quite off, but so was the West, despite the fact that the unification was the raison d'etre of the German entire post-war, statehood, so to speak. They did not believe it. They did not believe it. They published the documents about the 89. I think it was in 97 or several years later, much earlier than normally they do these things. They published the documents of this period, and they admitted that despite the fact that the German unity was the primary goal of German politics, they had not prepared a contingency plan. They just did not assume it would happen. So we had the productive triangle, and basically, 1 week later, or I think about 1 week after the wall had come down, I had written the first leaflet. I think the headline of it was "Continue, beloved Germany." Geliebtes Deutschland, weiter so. And it was the idea that this was the right process, and I already put in this idea of the development of Poland. And then, we went immediately to the borders. We talked to all the people in the eastern states, and by January we had the first pamphlet out, the Productive Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. And then we went in the coming year in 90. I think the first trip was to Hungary, then later to Poland, and this was a big deal. Don't think that it was such a self-evident thing to travel to meet people in Poland and in Hungary, because while the Iron Curtain was there, and if you had no relatives, like in East Germany, this was really an Iron Curtain. I mean, you had no connection, you had no, so to go there in an uncharted territory was quite something, because you did not know what to be expected, you didn't know what the reaction would be. But we went to all of these places and proposed the productive triangle, including, we had this huge conference already in the spring of 1990 in Berlin with many, many people from all over Eastern Europe, Russia, and, the germ of the Eurasian land bridge was laid there. And then we proposed the conference when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 91. We immediately, extended the productive triangle into the Eurasian land bridge, and we proposed a conference to all countries of Eurasia. And it took several years before it actually happened, but I know that this conference in 96 was the result of our proposals, and China was the only one who accepted the idea. So, in a certain sense, you can say it took a long time, but, I really think that, if you know that what you are proposing is the right thing, because it corresponds to the laws of the universe, because it corresponds to what is the true character of humanity, well, once you know that an idea is an adequate idea, then you are confident, and that's why I'm confident that, there is the absolute potential that the new paradigm can be realized in the near future. I wouldn't say that just to, cheer you up or make you happy or console you over the terrible circumstances of the United States. That is not why I'm saying that. I really believe it is possible. I'm also saying it's possible that the world is being blown up. But if I would not believe that, the true nature of humanity is to overcome challenges on a higher level, that Leibniz's idea that the great evil tends to, cause a bigger good to emerge. If that would not be the proof of the evolution of mankind, the tremendous progresses we have made, I think that is the absolute message of the future which we can bring to change and shape the present. So I don't know, I think our history proves that that principle is true.
Well, I think we've been as well prepared as we could be for what we've got to do tomorrow. I want to thank you, Helga, for what you've said to us here today, and I think we're going to now conclude today, so please join me in thanking Helga for what she's just done.
Thank you.